Hello and welcome to the Barcast, coming to you on a cool fall Monday afternoon here in New York. And we are moving on to the 8 today, which means we're also moving on from the thinking triad to the doing triad or the gut triad. These are types 8, 9, and 1 who experience the world through what needs to be done and what am I going to do about it. I talked elsewhere about my own connection between doing and what's right, doing what's right. So morality, you could call this the morality triad. That would be a little bit out there, but I like playing with that. So these are people who are they've got gut instinct. They're looking around at what needs to be done. Richard Rohr, who's a 1, which is in the gut triad, sort of describes this onslaught of experience. So these are people really kind of who live in their bodies, perhaps more than the other triads. And what else do we want to say about this work before we start? So the 8, 9, and 1, the 8 will be the most expressed type in the gut triad. That is to say, like they're going to be the most expressive of the doing triad. They're doers. They're very high energy. Suzanne Stabile starts her walkthrough of the Enneagram with the 8. And one of the reasons for that, she says, is that 8s, first of all, 8s are going to be like arms crossed, sort of adversarial, skeptical the whole time. So it's great to get them out of the way. This is Suzanne Stabile kind of in her Southern charm. Doesn't translate so well to me. And another reason is because 8s know they're 8s. It's pretty easy for 8s to self-recognize. So let's hear what Claudia Naranjo, who I think may have been an 8, but I don't know why I believe that. So anyway, here's what Naranjo has to say about the 8, whose passion is lust. The passion of lust denotes a passion for excess, a passion that seeks intensity, not only through sex, but in all kinds of stimuli, activity, anxiety, spices, high speed, loud music, etc. It transformed the intensity of suffering into the intensity of satisfaction, of feelings, of pleasure, and the battle against the abuses suffered. The type 8 is an excessive character, the most impulsive of the action-oriented types. The consumption of energy, the search for intense stimuli, the attraction to violence and risk, and the effusive manifestation of enthusiasm are all typical expressions of lust. Lust manifests itself through an uncontrollable tendency towards satisfying impulses and needs, a relentless pursuit of pleasure, understood not as surrendering to the senses or as well-being, but rather as an intense experience that brings back the sensation of being alive, and that can go beyond the barrier of hardness and insensitivity. In summary, one could say that their passion consists of obtaining satisfaction and gratification here and now, like a teenager. The future does not exist and the past is unnecessary. They are pragmatic and concrete. The problem must be solved immediately, and the problem is their need to possess and obtain satisfaction. The wound is an offense received, an abuse. The 8 feels and lives with the conviction that they must be immediately compensated. Their interpersonal style is revenge. That's their fixation. Accounts cannot be left unsettled. When they carry out revenge, they find fulfillment again. The origin of this character structure is found in a childhood where they were denied being a child. They did not receive proper care, either concretely or emotionally, psychologically. In extreme cases, we can find abuse and mistreatment that humiliated and subjugated them. This situation of oppression and abuse leads them to cultivate within a desire to respond to violence with the same vehemence and strength, while awaiting the day of final revenge. They are a child who had to grow up quickly, who could not surrender to weakness, tenderness, or fragility. They learn to fight and defend themselves and others from injustices. The strongest experience is the attribution of being a bad child. The sense of justice sometimes derives from a family context in which the paternal figure exercised violence concretely, physically, or psychologically, or abused their power, while the mother or siblings are perceived as victims of this violence and as objects to be rescued. The compulsion to restore their power at any cost clearly manifests itself in relationship with others. The sense of justice can also be an ideal, but it is above all a way to settle outstanding accounts. From this point of view, the relationship of friendship is one in which the 8 commits to defending close people on the condition that they do not interfere with their power. Power is maintaining dominance and control over their territory and the people who belong to it. The 8 lacks empathic capacity, considering that they are not in touch with their emotions. The bond with others can be very strong and intense, not because they are sensitive to the needs of others, but rather because they are driven by a compulsion to defend those who belong to them. Due to this lack of empathy in effective relationships, sentimental or friendship, they are unaware of how they may end up dominating their close ones, and they are unconcerned with others' judgments. They have great difficulty feeling guilt. They are autonomous and often despotic and overbearing. Their motivation is not to appear superior, but to obtain satisfaction for their needs. They learned to be strong, their body shows it. Thick skin, solid musculature, firmly grounded, confident behavior without revealing a state of alarm, and great resistance to both physical and psychological pain. Just as they do not allow themselves to feel their emotions, they also do not leave room for physical pain to the extent that they neglect their body. Even when they suffer, they find satisfaction in the intensity. So that's the 8, a pretty strongly worded introduction to the 8 and lust. A couple things I want to go back to. One is, and even reading this, sometimes I'm like, am I an 8? And 8, I've been mistyped a bunch as an 8. It's, I think my first experience with the Enneagram was getting mistyped as an 8. And I can kind of see it when you look at an 8 and compare it to a sexual 4 in particular, whose passion, the passion of the 4 is envy, and specifically the key word for the sexual 4 is competition. Sometimes it's hate. So you can see this. For the 8, there is that competition and that hate and that quest for domination. I can't be dominated. I must dominate, or else I will be dominated. I must be strong, or else people will step all over me. There's a lot of adversarial energy in both the 8 and the 4. But the 8 is high energy. The 8, there's a strength. The 8s feel strong. They feel bigger than potentially even than they are. So the 8 really, I would say, maybe has a more uncomplicated relationship with strength and dominance and autonomy and power. They want those things, and they live sort of in harmony with those desires. So they go get it. They go after it. They have arguments. They have confrontations. They're lusty. They might actually be physically strong, as Naranjo was saying here. Whereas the 4, it's more of like an act for the 4 to seem big. In a nutshell, the 4 doesn't actually have alignment between this, like, the 4's passion is envy. They basically they fundamentally feel inferior. They're most connected to that ontic lack, that vacuum, that emptiness that Naranjo is exploring in each of these nine types. Every type has its own vacuum, its own emptiness, there's no there. And the 4 is very much in contact with that experience. The 8 isn't. And then in a way, you can see that show up again. It comes up here where the 8 does get squishy and sweet with those who are weak, those who are vulnerable in their relationships, with children. When the 8 has the opportunity to take care of someone who's vulnerable without threatening their own need for autonomy, then they go there. So 8s can be very protective, very sweet with those who are vulnerable, because that's their happy place. That's sort of the other side of the coin. So you might not see it as often, but it's still consistent with the story that the 8 has constructed about who they need to be. And you won't see that with a 4. A 4 isn't going to show that same tenderness with those who are vulnerable. Not that they can't be, but you're not going to see sort of like this Robin Hood attack those in power and defend those in need. That the 4 doesn't have that like split. So those are some ways to potentially disambiguate the 4 from the 8. But not to say that I don't have 8 energy, and we all have some energy from each of the 9 types. But it's sometimes interesting for me to disambiguate when I'm, because I do have a sort of confrontational approach at times. The 8 is like, gosh, if everyone could just be direct, think about how much time we would save. If everyone just said exactly what was on their mind, and if we've got a disagreement, let's have a fight, let's hash it out, and we'll figure it out from there. That's kind of, the 8 wants a gladiator style tournament of battles. That feels to the 8 like a really good way to get things done. The 5 goes to 8. So if you think about, I'm just using software engineering because a lot of the audience, and my own experience, software engineers, a stereotypical software engineer who might be a 5, and in the world of ideas, you will see a lot of software engineers love to kind of have this direct battle it out, battleground of ideas, directness. And that's a great way for a 5 to preserve their need for resources and time, right? I'm not even going to talk to you unless you send me a thing, the answer is no unless you can do this, right? So just like that confrontational, no saying, F you energy. And then what else is here? Yeah, I think, again, I always get a little bit tense when Naranjo or anyone else moves into the generalized story. It's one thing for the personal accounts of family history, but as he did with the 7, Naranjo again moves to the parent kind of archetype. But I think this one is easier to understand in the abstract than the 7. Remember, the 7 sort of had an absent father, i.e. no law and order, no authority, and then had a depressed mother, which was sort of this black hole of needing positivity and encouragement. So that was Naranjo's framing of the 7. For the 8, Naranjo's framing is a cruel father. So the father is present, but the paternal figure exercised cruelty, showed kind of authority through violence, authority through intimidation, while the mother was sort of seen as the victim of that, or a little sister, little brother, so somebody was weak and needed to be rescued. So that's kind of a neat explanation for this. Essentially, if you're accessing Freud in this context, and we might as well, since we're doing it all, like this is the Oedipal complex writ large, right? I've got to destroy my father, who is a cruel monster, and I've got to romance or save, protect my mother, And yeah, you see Donald Trump, who is the way he is because he had a monstrous father. And that would sort of be an unhealthier, the ancestral lineage of cruelty and of abuse. I was abused, so I will abuse the other. He was cruel to me, so I'll be cruel to the next person. That kind of hardening, that to me feels like the 8 energy that's being described here. But that's sort of on the unhealthier side of 8. I think there's also a healthy 8 who just learned early that they are strong and they need to be strong, and their strength, their value is in their strength. They need to be strong. I must be strong. So therefore I must deny my weakness. I must deny my vulnerability. I must be strong so I can protect others. So I'll be keen to explore themes of cruelty, dominance, strength throughout. But the sense that I get is at their core, the 8 doesn't want to dominate necessarily. At their core, the 8 just wants to not be dominated. And preemptively dominating is one of the survival strategies for an 8. But a healthy 8 might have other survival strategies in the quest to not be dominated, or their need for autonomy, their need for self-sufficiency. Again, there's that 5 again. I must not rely on others. But the way that the 5 decides not to rely on others is by, and again, decides, all these words are in scare quotes because this is unconscious construction of personality, but the 5 decides to negate their own needs. I just won't have needs. Whereas the 8 is like, I will get my needs met now, and I'll make sure, and I'll fight to get them met. But they also might limit their needs, that they might make sure that their needs are all things that they can get done themselves. Right? Like if I'm an 8 in the romantic landscape, well, then maybe I'll be a very protective, nurturing, masculine 8. That way I don't need anything from my partner. So I kind of get what I want, but my wants are already sort of pre-filtered so that I'm not vulnerable, so that I'm not weak. I want to have a traditional home, and I want to provide for the family. I want to have sex every week. I want to provide financially. Sort of patriarchal structures sort of would support 8 thinking there. I was interested to hear about injustice because the morality of the 8 isn't so clear to me. I think they clearly have a sense of justice and right and wrong, and I talked about morality, right and wrong, in the context of the doing triad. But compared to the 1 and the 9, who I would say have more, you'll experience 1s and 9s as more obviously moral. The 8 I don't think of as showing much of a moral compass. I would say they're kind of amoral. But so I guess their notions of justice and injustice are going to be highly personal. They'll hold some sense of justice, but it might be an adolescent sense of justice. I think we're in good shape for the subtypes. There's a quality here, since we're moving on from the 7 into the 8, that I want to paint that brush from the 7 to the 8 a little bit. So I think like the 7, the 8 survival strategy, it makes a lot of sense. So the 7, I'll avoid pain and I'll seek pleasure. And then the 7 seeks pleasure, and they experience pleasure and they have pleasure. but pleasure goes away. And so they're very active, they're hyperactive, and they're always looking for the next thing. They're very sensitive to when the pleasure wanes or when things start to get a little bit sticky, and then they need the distraction, they need the next thing. So sevens, their kind of spiritual risk is shallowness or fraudulence. The 8 similarly is like I won't be weak. I will just make sure that I'm always in a position of strength and always getting intense experience, getting what I want, fighting for what I want. The 8, where the 7 likes pleasure, the 8 likes intensity. Basically, the 8 has done this clever little move where the 8 has found a way to make everything pleasurable because intensity is pleasure for the 8. So a fight is pleasurable for the 8. So now they've got access to the whole spectrum, but there's so much struggle there. Everything is, when struggle is pleasurable, then everything becomes a struggle. And we'll learn more about the personal anecdotes, but I think one of the reasons that 8s maybe undertake spiritual work is that they eventually just break down. They're the type to overexert themselves, and then either overexert themselves or overexert their romantic partner or their family, like just too much. So they also have sort of a pretty simple failure mode in a way, and the same thing with the 7, where a 7 maybe enters this work through addiction or a traumatic event that they don't have a way to process. I think the 8 oftentimes will maybe just enter this work through like, I can't go on having things at 11 all the time. But it's a pretty good strategy while it lasts, right? Just like carpe diem, live it up, live life to the max. It feels a little 7-ish, but it can move into that intensity. And then revenge, I guess I just want to say one last thing about revenge. So that's the fixation of the 8. So the passion is sort of the motivation, and the fixation, they're related, but the idea is like the world kind of, you start to see the world through a lens of sorts. So what is the connection between lust and revenge, and on what level do we mean revenge? It's not just the most basic idea of revenge of like, I'm going to get him or her. I think one way to look at it is like, so I loved what Naranjo said about like compensatory. There's this feeling of there's been an early injustice and I must get compensation. So the 8 is always looking for getting compensation. And I guess in one way that's already a revenge fixation, right? Everybody owes me something. And so I need justice, but I need compensation. So there's that aspect of revenge, but it gets compounded, I think, because all of the satisfaction that the 8 is going to be getting through these means is ultimately not going to be satisfying. All the compensation will not be satisfying. None of the getting my needs met, getting what I want, winning the argument, none of that is going to heal the original wounding. And the pain of that dissatisfaction would make the 8 want to bite even more. They want some ultimate revenge. I think that's important the way Naranjo describes it. He says, their interpersonal style is revenge. Accounts cannot be left unsettled. When they carry out revenge, they find fulfillment again. So they do carry out revenge and they get fulfillment, but for only so long. And then there's always, then it's almost like you duped me. I don't know. I don't want to get ahead of myself. So let's end here, and then we'll learn a lot more when we get into the accounts of the 3 subtypes.